Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., Grace arrived at the towering glass building where she worked as a maid. She was a quiet woman in her 50s, with a presence so gentle that people barely noticed her, but she noticed everything. With her cleaning cart and a soft smile, she moved through the marble-floored executive wing, always nodding politely to the early staff but never saying a word. On this particular morning, something unusual caught her attention. Through the large glass wall of the CEO's office, she saw the new CEO, Mr. Blake, seated at his desk, clearly agitated. He was on a video call, gesturing with his hands in a flurry of motion that didn't quite seem like anger. It looked like he was trying to communicate but couldn't get through. His shoulders tensed, his face flushed, and he finally lowered his hands in frustration. Grace hesitated, standing by her cart. Something about the way he moved sparked a memory. She took a few tentative steps forward, gently knocked on the glass, and when he looked up, she signed slowly and clearly, "Do you need help?" Mr. Blake froze, staring at her in disbelief. Then, without saying a word, he signed back. Grace's heart skipped. He was deaf. All this time, people thought he was just silent, reserved, maybe even cold. But he wasn't distant by choice. He had simply been trying to speak in a language no one around him understood. Until now. She stepped inside, and for the next few minutes, the executive floor, usually so formal and rigid, held something soft, something human. Grace and Mr. Blake signed fluently, easily. The walls between them dissolved. He asked her how she knew sign language, and she responded that her late son had been deaf. She hadn't used it in years, but it never left her. In that moment, something shifted. The CEO who led an empire was finally able to express himself. And the maid who swept unnoticed through polished hallways became the only person who truly saw him. Neither of them realized it then, but that brief, quiet encounter was about to change both their lives, and the entire company, forever. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the CEO's office, a rare and unexpected scene unfolded. The usual air of formality that surrounded the space seemed to melt away as Grace and Mr. Blake communicated, no voices, just graceful movements of the hands, fluent and expressive. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. For the first time since he'd taken the role, Mr. Blake wasn't being judged by his silence or misunderstood for his lack of speech. He was being heard in the language that had always been his own. Grace signed with a natural comfort that surprised him. She wasn't just communicating, she was connecting. He watched her hands move gently, her eyes kind and steady. For a man who had spent years navigating a world that barely tried to understand him, this moment felt almost surreal. Curious and moved, Mr. Blake signed, "Where did you learn?" Grace smiled, a bittersweet tenderness in her eyes. She responded, "My late son was deaf. I still speak his language." The room grew still. There was no need for more words. In that quiet, there was deep emotion. It wasn't an empty silence, it was the fullness of shared experience, of two people who understood loss, isolation, and the deep yearning to connect. Though their paths in life had been vastly different, one a high-powered executive, the other a humble maid, they had both carried invisible burdens. And now, through nothing more than kindness and timing, those burdens felt lighter. They sat in that silence for a while, hands still, no more signs exchanged. But everything had changed. In Grace's presence, Mr. Blake didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who had finally been seen. And Grace wasn't just a cleaner anymore, she was the only person who had reached him, not with ambition or pretense, but with simple human compassion. In that brief moment, two strangers found a powerful bond, not built on status, but on shared humanity. Later that afternoon, the break room buzzed with quiet chatter and raised eyebrows. Grace, the maid everyone thought they knew, had been seen leaving the CEO's office, alone, calm, and strangely composed. She was in there for nearly an hour, someone whispered over coffee. What could a maid possibly have to discuss with Mr. Blake? Another replied, confused and curious. Theories spread quickly. Some thought she was being reprimanded, others suspected she'd uncovered some secret. But no one knew the truth. Grace didn't speak of it. She moved through the building the way she always did, gently, humbly. She wiped down tables, emptied trash bins, and smiled her quiet smile. If anyone asked her directly, she just nodded and changed the subject. But behind her stillness, something had shifted. Grace carried a private moment, a quiet connection that meant more to her than any recognition ever could. She hadn't helped the CEO for praise or attention. She simply saw a man who needed understanding, and she offered it without question. The rumors continued to swirl, but Grace remained unchanged, until the next morning. Just after she arrived and clocked in, two suited men approached her. They weren't stern or aggressive, just formal, respectful. One of them said softly, "Miss Grace, the CEO has requested your presence again. Please come with us." Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Grace paused for a moment, confusion flickering across her face. But she followed them without a word, her cart left behind, her heart suddenly heavy with wonder. Something was happening. Something she never expected. As Grace stepped into the boardroom, she was met with a sight she never imagined: polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with morning light, and a dozen high-ranking executives seated in silence. At the head of the table stood Mr. Blake, composed and confident, but his eyes softened when they met hers. Grace clutched her hands nervously, unsure why she had been brought here. She had never been in a room like this, never expected to stand among people in tailored suits and power positions. Her heart pounded. Then Mr. Blake signed to her, clearly and slowly, his expression full of warmth. "Grace, your kindness reminded me of what this company has forgotten: people." He turned to the board members, who watched in respectful silence as he continued, this time speaking aloud for their sake. "This company is built on innovation, but we've neglected the most human element of all: communication, inclusion, empathy. Grace reminded me what it means to truly connect." Then came the words that made her breath catch. "I'm appointing her as the head of our new Accessibility and Inclusion Initiative. She'll train every employee in basic sign language and help us build a culture where no voice, spoken or unspoken, is left unheard." There was a stunned silence. Some executives nodded. A few clapped. But Grace stood frozen, her eyes filling with tears. Her lip trembled, and her hand slowly rose to sign, "Thank you." She wasn't just being recognized for a moment of kindness. She was being seen, not as a maid, not as someone overlooked, but as someone with value, wisdom, and heart. For years, she had worked quietly in the background. Today, she was standing at the center of change. In that room filled with power and influence, it wasn't the title or position that mattered most. It was compassion. And Grace, who had offered hers so freely, was now being honored in a way she never dreamed. Not for cleaning floors, but for lifting hearts. 1 week later, the energy in the building felt different, warmer, more open, as if something unseen had shifted. In the company's main conference room, chairs were lined up neatly, filled with employees from every department. There were no titles here, no hierarchy, just people, ready to learn. At the front stood Grace, no longer in her cleaning uniform, but dressed with quiet confidence. Her hands moved gracefully as she introduced the first words, "Hello. How are you? Thank you." She spoke each one softly, then signed it slowly, patiently, encouraging the employees to try along with her. Laughter bubbled up when someone signed it backward. Another clapped in excitement after getting it right. The room was alive, not with pressure, but with connection. Barriers were being broken down, one hand sign at a time. And in the back corner, standing quietly, was Mr. Blake. His arms were crossed, but his hands moved with hers, mirroring every gesture. He didn't need to lead the room. Grace was doing that. And he had never been prouder. People weren't just learning a new skill. They were learning to see each other. To hear those who had never been heard. To understand the power of simply trying to connect. Grace looked out at the room, at the faces smiling back at her, at the hands forming signs, at the culture already changing, and felt a wave of peace wash over her. She hadn't set out to change anything. She had only offered kindness to someone who needed it. But sometimes, the smallest act of compassion speaks louder than words. And sometimes, it changes everything.